Good evening. I welcome you back to the Co-Cathedral of St. John the Evangelist, and I'm very pleased to see everyone again here tonight. And also, I welcome everyone in the live stream for our fourth session of our reflection on Lent and the events of Easter through classical art. As has been our practice, I have chosen 3 works of art to explore in detail tonight, which are all highly moving and invite us to contemplate the suffering of Christ and to behold God's infinite love and forgiveness. The first painting we will explore tonight is the Flagellation of Christ by Sebastiano, which is a mural in the Untitled Chapter in the Church of San Pietro in Rome. In 1511, Sebastiano arrived in Rome during a time of great rivalry, especially between Michelangelo and Raphael. Michelangelo, a great craftsman, sculptor, and creator of frescoes, was somewhat reluctant to execute oil paintings, and so offered Sebastiano the opportunity to collaborate with him. This professional alliance led to a friendship which lasted 25 years. Many art historical scholars have explored this friendship, and they have revealed that they supported each other with ideas. In also practical terms, Michelangelo provided a number of preparatory drawings for some of Sebastiano's commissions. I will now digress for a few minutes to examine the use of preparatory drawings with examples by artists of the Renaissance and Baroque era. And then we will return later to all the paintings. The ability to sketch and draw the human figure, its anatomical details, and arrange it in artistic compositions was highly regarded during that time. Surviving drawings from the 15th, 16th, and 17th century offered a chance to see the evolution of a pictorial idea from infancy to the final state. Preparatory drawings can also showcase how artists often collaborated with each other and then how they created the final product. Today, these preparatory drawings are highly thought after by museums, and they demand a high price at auctions. But in their day, such works on paper served a much more utilitarian purpose. They were just a space for the artist to create some ideas. This tradition of preparatory drawings had taken root in the 14th century, when paper, especially so-called late paper, was developed and became more available. From that point, independent drawing rapidly became a key means for artists across the European continent to prepare for a commission or to work out specific elements for a forthcoming composition. Renaissance and Baroque preparatory drawings can be divided into 3 general categories that relate to the degree of its finish and detail in the overall artistic process. The first category of preparatory drawings is preliminary drawings, which we can see here on this slide. This preliminary drawing is a pen and ink drawing by Raphael. He's developing ideas how to position the Christ child on the Virgin's arm. And I think that is really beautiful how he goes through different iterations of moving the child up. And also he's working out the relationship between Mary and the child. I think this is particularly beautiful. I don't have ever seen, at least in the Renaissance or Baroque time, such an intimate relationship between the Christ child and the Virgin. But it certainly crossed his mind, or someone's mind. So he's again rearranging the child, and this is actually very similar to one of his paintings where the Christ child turns back and they are in direct eye contact with each other. So it's just beautiful. He must have very quickly had a couple of thoughts and then just sketched them out and played with his ideas. The second category of preparatory drawings is live drawing on paper, as shown here on the slide, on the left. This is one of the most significant drawings by Michelangelo. For this drawing, a male studio model posed for the anatomical study, which was preparatory for the Libyan Sibyl, an ancient prophetess, who is one of the female figures frescoed on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. As we can see on the right, in the fresco, the figure is wearing clothes, just her arms and her strong shoulders are still very similar to the drawing on the left. Michelangelo used the life drawing to explore the elements that were crucial in the elegant resolution of the figure's pose, especially the counterpoint twist of shoulders and hips, and the manner of weight bearing on her toe. On the right-hand edge of the drawing, there is a repeated study of Sibyl's big toe as it bends to support the weight of the turning figure. And I kind of zoomed into this. Again, he just played with multiple iterations and how he had to bend the toes to make it realistic that she could turn on the spot and then put her weight on it because she's leaning forward to reach out to the hook. These elements speak to Michelangelo's study of the body, but given they are relatively minute elements in an otherwise monumental fresco, suggests that even working on such a colossal scale, Michelangelo lavished attention on even the tiniest of detail. Just to put these works into perspective, the fresco of the Libyan Sibyl took 20 days of work to complete. We are now left to guess how long Michelangelo thought about the preparatory drawing, bring it all together. The third category of preparatory drawings are the models and cartoons. These are formal, full-scale, finished drawings which could serve as a final pitch for the artists to share their plans for a commission with their patrons, offering a preview of the finished painting or fresco. After that, most often, the finished cartoons were then used to transfer the drawing onto a canvas or the walls for a fresco. On this slide, we can see the cartoon for a painting by the Vittore Carpaccio in pen and ink with grey-brown wash over sharp underline. On the right, you see that the cartoon was pricked. So these are all little holes that were done with a needle. And then they would use very fine charcoal dust, which they would rub over. So the drawing would go onto a canvas. It was pricked, and then they would dust it with charcoal. And the charcoal would fall through these holes and would leave a tiny little fine outline of all the details. And so with that, the painter could then work and bring in paint. The image on the right is a result of of the Virgin with clasped hand, and her fingers are clearly visible, so I cannot do. So this part is magnified, and we can see the outline of the fingers here. And so that would be done with the entire cartoon. So it would go different like folds, so that artists had kind of roughly something to work with. With this background information in mind, it is now a good time to return our attention to our first painting, The Flagellation of Christ by Sebastiano. Sebastiano Luciani, later also known as Sebastiano del Piombe, was born in 1485 in Venice. He became a pupil of Giovanni Bellini in Giorgione, where he learned to execute the execution of soft light and the traditional emphasis in gorgeous colors using oil paintings. Some of the finest works of Sebastiano's Roman years are his portraits. And after Raphael's death in 1520, he had no rival in the city in this area. Pope Clement VII, the subject of one of Sebastiano's finest portraits, appointed him keeper of the papal seal in 1531. And after this, Sebastiano was less active as a painter. The papal seal was made out of lead, which is piombo in Italian, hence Sebastiano's nickname, Del Piombo. As we discussed earlier, Michelangelo had a collaboration with Sebastiano, and Michelangelo, made a preparatory drawing of the figure of Christ for Sebastiano's flagellation for the Boccherini chapel. As we see here, Michelangelo's figure of Christ is just slightly changed in the final work by Sebastiano. I hope you can see this. This is a very light image. It's very much the Christ figure in the finished painting. As you observe this picture, I will read a short passage from the Suffering's Servant from the book of Isaiah. It's Isaiah 53:5. But he was wounded for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the punishment that made us whole, and by his bruises we are healed. With these words in mind, as we have done before, I invite you to start to explore this painting with me. And I think we can just start with what can we see, who can we see, and then start to contemplate that and what it means for us.
So we always talk about the light, and light is sort of our whole using all of your skills, like back up.
They are. Yeah. If we use the microphone, because it's easier than
I just mentioned that we talked a lot about the light and the halo over Jesus, and it's not exactly over him, but it is in the background.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought it was, it's kind of the halo for him, the space. Yes.
Did you want to say something? No. Okay.
Yeah, so maybe I lead in, and then, so we have Christ, which is right in the center of the painting, and then we would do our orthogonal lines, it would kind of right into the center of Christ. He's tied with his hands back on onto a column, and he's in a kind of a Roman columned hall. There's 4 other people around him, 4 other figures, and there's 2 to his right and 2 on his left. I think what this quite comes out as we look at it. Jesus, he's depicted in very light colors, his very light skin, and that's very much in contrast to the other figures, which are darker skin. And I think this is shining through his divinity in this picture. The 4 figures, also if you compare the way they're depicted, they're kind of echoing each other's movements. And this is the scene. Jesus is not wounded at this point. So we're just entering the scene before they start coming down with the whips on Christ. I think it's his position. He's calm. He's looking down. He's anticipating his suffering and his sorrow, but he's not fighting it. And I think kind of what's been carried through the message, Christ was ready, and he had the greater goal in mind, and he knew he had to go through the suffering for humanity. He had to go through this, and he trusted in God that he will be carried through this.
You know, Dr. McGregor, you kind of answered my question that I had, because I was wondering, with different artists, painters, sculptors, when they are presenting, I love when you said there's a light on his body and the others are dark. No, possibly the divinity. And then, so would they have in mind, I want to show particularly suffering, or I want to show humanity, or I want to demonstrate what? You know, so I'm kind of interested, would an artist have something, and clearly would have something in mind, no? And so here it would be more, I like your word, he appears to be calm, appears to be ready, anticipating, maybe, no? Because in all of this, they had to have some passion that they wanted to communicate, is it right?
Yes. And we have touched upon that before, and that the artist was in the situation that he wanted to depict Christ in his dual role, which is fully divine but also fully human. And many artists would try to use the illumination, so illuminate the body, and I think also setting Christ apart from the humans. And I think Sebastiano used the much gentler coloring for Jesus' body to kind of do that. And I had, so the part that I read is just very brief, but there's a much longer text of the Song of the Suffering Servant. And if we read the verses carefully, we will note how much pain, suffering, and sorrow that Jesus, the suffering servant, actually had to endure. He's also called a man of sorrows because of how much suffering he had to endure. And it's not just at this point in his life that he had to endure suffering. Through his entire life, I mean, he left heaven for us. He came down to become a man. And with becoming human, he just naturally had to endure a lot of suffering. And so, in many stages throughout his life, he suffered. And at this point, it was obviously the final suffering that he had to go through. But I think it does show, since we were talking about Kant, he is focused on the final outcome. I mean, he knows why he's doing it, and he knows where he will go with the glory that he will receive.
What is the significance of the two in the back?
The two figures in the back, is there any particular significance for them?
No, I didn't come across any. I think it's just a number of flagellators were there to soften up Christ.
Like soldiers, or?
I think in the biblical story it was soldiers.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and again, quite often artists might choose to either, we have explored last week, that they would place figures in more contemporary clothing, not necessarily in ancient dress. I think again, very much he depicts the four of them as a unit. Also there's the white and the green, the right and the green is opposite, and then again they're so symmetrically divided around. So they are kind of a unit going after Christ and punishing him.
Yeah, I don't know if this question is reasonable, so if it isn't, throw it out. But when I think of artists like this, and then you think of Mel Gibson's presentation, the way to present the passion, the way to present all of this, could you contrast? Or is that an unfair question?
I think that's a great question. I'm not familiar with pointing to the movie.
Yes.
Mel Gibson. I'm not sure I've really seen it, and
Okay.
it's a long time ago. But that would be a fascinating exercise to do, because obviously film is just a modern art, a form of art.
Yeah.
And when they make a movie, as much thought goes into the different scene and the costume and what they're going to say with the costume that the actors are wearing, as much as this. So that would be a great exercise, actually, to see.
I was thinking about the Passion movie too, and I thought of two things. One, the setting for this scene looks a lot more like 1500s Italy than it does first century Jerusalem.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, with all the marble columns and all that. The other thing is, they made a decision in the Passion of the Christ that he would have his back, Jesus would have his back to the people scourging him. And I don't know if we know historically how the Romans did everything very methodically, but when you're doing a painting like this, you can't really have the center figure with his back to you. So regardless of what was done historically, you have to have Jesus facing forward. But the movie had him with his back to the people with the whips.
Okay. Absolutely. So I think that the artists have artistic freedom, and because they also want us to be able to engage with the picture. So I think for us to be able to see Christ's face, I think it's very, very important. So we can pity him, we can go with him on this journey. So yeah. So definitely artists made changes as it would work best for them, and how they thought it would create the best reaction in the viewer. mirror. So they very much had the viewer and also the patron who paid for the work in mind to kind of please them. One other thought that I had come across was that flagellation is a metaphor for the whole church, not just for the individuals. Christ's body represents the church, so that the suffering that befalls Christ must also be endured by the church before it can obtain its final restoration. So, in addition to this, I also would like to point out that as part of the Brini chapel, above the flagellation, Sebastiano also painted the Transfiguration. And Christ, and so this is life-size, and then in the half-dome space, the Transfiguration has been painted. And the figures of Christ are kind of on the same axis and also the same size. This is a reproduction from the National Gallery in London. So they could, because they had a big exhibition in 2017 of the collaboration between Michelangelo and Sebastiano. And just a couple of technical, interesting parts. If you look at this, it's quite shiny, and as I mentioned before, Sebastiano used oil on this, on drywall, and as we remember, it works for some and it doesn't work for others, unfortunately with the Last Supper. Sebastiano was an expert in using this technique, so it's in very good condition even today. In the Transfiguration, it's much flatter, it's kind of a matte. And that's because he then changed to work this produce this as a fresco. So again, working the paint into wet plaster. And then here's just I just zoomed into it. And then it's a link of flat, there's also saints, Peter and Francis and Isaiah and St. Peter are part of the invention because St. Peter and Isaiah had foreseen the suffering of Christ. And as a kind of a final thought on this, through the combination of the two paintings, Sebastiano refers to the revelation that glory will follow the passion. Christ's physical suffering in the flagellation was the first step towards his glorification as represented in the Transfiguration. And I'd like to leave this painting with a question. And these are questions that come to me. I haven't studied theology, but I spend quite a lot of time looking at this, and this is just what I ask myself. And certainly at the beginning of it, and still, it's like, do I fully understand Christ's suffering and what it means for my life, for me? The second painting of this evening continues our journey with Christ through his suffering. It is called Christ, Man of Sorrows, by Perrier. It is a slightly different representation of Christ carrying his cross to Golgotha. A bio-sketch of Paradise on the handouts, and I'm just kind of skipping that. You can read it just to kind of keep the momentum on going from the paintings. Now I will read another section of the Song of the Suffering Servant. This is Isaiah 53:7. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before his shearers is silent. So he did not open his mouth. anyone would like to comment on the painting, either technical parts, the colors, I invite anyone to share their thoughts or ideas or what they feel about it. It's one of my favorite pictures because it is quite different than what you have seen or what one would think of in this.
So, Dr. Marie, you said you weren't a theologian, but you sound like one. So, you do very well theological reflection, may I say. Yeah. So, I was just wondering, sorry, this is not so much, well, it's focused, but the contrast of the Spaniard and the Mexican maybe, and, in general, my experience of the Spanish, I don't want to say being more brutal, but being more dramatic. I don't know what the right word is. Can you give a little insight into that?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think a direct hint to that is if we look at the thorn crown. It is so in detail and so it really you can imagine how much this hurts, how much pain it is inflicting on Jesus. And I think that very much is a kind of a Spanish way of being very direct. Quite often if we think of other paintings where we see Christ wearing a thorn crown, there are some thorns, but it's much milder. This definitely, I think, yes, I very much agree with that. They were very direct, and particularly in this time. So this is a work painting. Again, we talked last week about Caravaggio, who also was very direct and would produce very simple compositions, but direct to the point. And so I think in this one, very much the same.
What I find so striking.
Take the microphone.
What I find so striking is what amounts to a noose around his neck, coming down, and it just pops out at me, is in the humiliation, to be humiliated and tortured in that manner.
Yes. Yes. Again, that's a beautiful detail and very stark. And I love the word humiliation because he was humiliated. He was dragged. The soldiers pulled him on the rope through the town up to Co-Cathedral. So humiliation is a wonderful word. And I think the painter also very much worked on making a striking difference between the wonderful smooth skin and then the rough robe. And similarly with the crown, one can feel the roughness, or one can sense the roughness of the robe that's around his neck and inflicting the wounds. And because in this painting now, we see Christ's skin is wounded, he's bleeding. So it's very, very rough. And it's very similar, so the part that I was particularly amazed about is this. It's a tree trunk that still has its bark on it. We're so used to see a cross that has been beautifully worked and is smooth, and like someone spent a lot of time preparing this cross. But when you think back, I don't think that happened. I think this is much more realistic. Unfortunately, I think the Romans crucified people quite often. They didn't employ someone to create beautiful crosses. it was just rough trees, and then again it's like someone just used an axe and just axed away the branches, just kind of made it ready. And it's a beautiful alignment with Jesus. It's the tree has been wounded, and I think Christ has been wounded too. And when we talk about botany, if you inflict something to a tree, it starts bleeding. So it's the same word. So it's a beautiful comparison between Jesus and what happens to him and the part of his cross that he's carrying. And then again, artists very often like to use different finishes of the surfaces. So he took a lot of work on beautiful detail of Christ's skin and make it really smooth and perfect. And then in contrast the roughness of the cross. So I think that's just very, very powerful. It makes it a really powerful image.
What I find interesting is that it's a really heavy tree, and it seems like he's tied to this heavy burden. The rope goes around that tree. It's really heavy, so I find that symbolic.
Yeah, and that's actually also something I came across while studying for these images. Christ, he wasn't just punished, but he was particularly harshly punished. Because if we remember the two thieves that were crucified together with Christ, they didn't have to carry their cross. They were walking up, or some images you can show them in the back of a cart. It was Christ. So it's not just, he wasn't just punished for us, but he was severely punished to carry our sins. So yes, I think that's kind of led me to make that connection too. Yes, microphone, sorry.
Just quickly, I'm struck by the difference in the expression on Jesus' face from the first one, that I'm ready for this, and now it's kind of a, do we really have to do this kind of look?
Yes.
Much more than angry.
Yes, thank you for saying that. Yes, his eyes are looking up, and he's hoping for something. So
because he's looking at something very, very high. And of course, when in the garden, he asked his father to let this cup pass. And so it's as if he's saying, okay, you call the shots, here I am. But yeah, that certainly really.
yes, yeah. No, I think so too. And then I think that's this back and forth a little bit in Christ's mind too, which is understandable. I mean, I think most of the time he knows he has to go through it, and he can deal with it. But I'm sure there were moments where he questioned why he was supposed to do that. So again, it's kind of probably the interplay between his divinity, when he was sure this is what I have to do and I'm doing it, but then also this humanity saying this is hard. Yeah, I think that's yes.
He's bound to the cross like a rope, but he's also embracing the cross with his hands, with his being. It's, as you said, both his humanity and his divinity. So he's taking it.
Yes.
And I think he's still in communion with the Father, the look.
Yes. Yeah.
Is it possible with this rope around it, almost like a hanging?
Yeah. But actually, so while I prepare this, I have a lot of conversation with my husband. And so he was actually saying, Christ wasn't hung. why is he wearing a robe? And then so, right, it was to hold him up to God, but it could be another way of death that could have been inflicted on him. Yes.
I also think church fathers have, and it goes back probably to St. Peter, that they contrast the tree in the Garden of Eden, which represents death, and they call the cross the tree of life, even though we don't normally think of it as a tree. So I think, my guess is that one of the things the artist had in mind was that this was that imagery of the cross being the tree that gave us life, in terms of the way that he depicted it, so much as it looking like a tree.
Mm-hmm.
And he's also got the red color, which we've talked about in the past, represents the bloodshed.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. And that's why I love asking you for your thoughts, because there's my thoughts and my learning, but it's like the Mayo brothers say, right? Two pairs of eyes are better than one, and so many thoughts really bring us together. And I think, again, that was a beautiful analogy.
And when he first receives his cross in the Passion of the Christ, he hugs it too in the movement. So that symbolicism of hugging the cross is in the movie as well.
Okay. And to kind of finish up with a couple of technical, so again we have this tenebrae that we just learned last week from Caravaggio's, and the artist placed the main figure in kind of a obscure dark background to help us to really focus on the important issues of the story. And also his light very much really brings up, so our gaze rises up and we kind of see Christ's face, and then also reflected with the cross. Yeah, so, and maybe to finish this, I had a lot of finishing thoughts. The painting invites us to meditate on Christ's passion. Christ is wearing a crown of thorns and holds an unhinged cross, communicating with great directness all the suffering and heroism of his sacrifice. However, we are also conscious that Christ's suffering has not yet ended. My question is that, can I accept and endure my own suffering? So with this, would like to move on. I would like to end tonight's session. I would like to turn to one of the most magnificent paintings, which comforts us with the knowledge that God the Father will always be there to receive us and forgive a repentant sinner, no matter what. This painting is the Return of the Prodigal Son by Rembrandt. It was completed in 1669, and it is believed that it was one of Rembrandt's last paintings, as he had passed away in that same year. Rembrandt van Rijn was born in Leiden in 1606. He was a famous Dutch painter in the 17th century. He is considered one of the greatest visual artists of all time for mastering painting, draftsman, and printmaking skills. Rembrandt often painted portraits, self-portraits, and scenes from the Bible. His famous self-portraits over his lifetime helped to create a story of his life while demonstrating his humble and sincere nature. His biblical representations showed his knowledge while also providing a glimpse into his compassion for humanity. Despite never having left his home nation, Rembrandt's works became internationally recognized and celebrated. I would like to read 2 sentences from the parable of the prodigal and his brother. So that's actually, and I think this is quite important to keep that title of the parable in mind as we explore the painting. So Luke 15:11-32. Then the father said to him, "Son, you were always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we have to celebrate and rejoice, because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found." So with this little reading, for the last time for tonight, I would like to explore this painting together with your help. So again, what you see, who are the figures? Or if you're more comfortable with the technical parts, there's lots to
I can get us started. This is one of the most famous paintings. And it's hard to tell from a distance, but the father's left hand is a lot more masculine than his right hand. And so scholars have said it kind of, the artist Rembrandt, I guess, intended to show like fatherly love and motherly love in the same person. Which is interesting. I'm not even sure if I would have noticed that if I hadn't read it. But the prominent figure to the right is believed to be the judgmental brother.
Yes.
Kind of crossing his arms in judgment. And then the other 2 figures, I guess, we don't know for sure who they are. The person in the center, people have speculated it might be the mother. And the person sitting down, the speculation, at least according to Wikipedia, is like an estate attorney maybe, or a tax collector, because he's dressed very well, like he's wealthy, but we don't know for sure who those sort of faded characters are in the background.
Yeah. And also, just to be complete, there's another figure in the background here, which is very faint. And again, because Rembrandt hadn't left any of his thoughts about this painting, which was very common not to. So painters really left it to us to explore his painting. So we very true, we don't really know who the figures in the background are. But yes, so this is the brother who had stayed with the father, and everyone is familiar with the story. And this is the prodigal son who has returned and is being received by his father. And this painting is, I was comparing it for myself, almost like a still life painting. There's no, it's about stillness. It's about the moment that the father receives the son back into his life, and it's so full of feeling. The tenderness. I mean, it's palpable. I mean, so it's such a wonderful feeling that the father is expressing towards his son that has come back to him. In the prodigal son isn't in rags. his shoes or his sandals are worn, his feet are cracked, which is reference to the journey he has taken to come back after he realized that he's sinned and that he was on the wrong path of life. And all the hardships he had to endure. His clothes are in rags. He doesn't even wear a belt, and it's a robe. The one thing that he had kept, is a dagger, and scholars believe that was kind of his last symbol, or for him his last association with the life he had before, and the status that he had before in his life. So he hadn't given that up quite yet, and it also, he needed that to probably defend himself, because the life he was leading towards the end wasn't a very good life, and he was probably in kind of a rather rough companionship. So it was definitely important for him to have that with him. And so, speaking of the older brother a little bit, because when we look at the picture, we tend to focus on the prodigal son and the father, and how we believe in my heart. I know that God will always forgive me if I turn around and repent. But it is also important to keep the other brother in mind, because he is kind of the good person, right? He never disobeyed the father. He was there. But if we think of his reaction throughout the parable, he also was mostly interested in the earthly goods of his father, because he was so upset when the father gave a big banquet for his brother who had returned and killed the calf. So he was very upset, and he was probably worried almost. He now would have to share again his share. So even though he's coming from the other side and things, he's kind of the good, but he didn't have his father in mind, really, because if he would have had his father in mind, he would be happy for the father that he was able to embrace his lost son at this point again. And so I think it really is a story of the two brothers, not just of the son that had come. And just a couple of other things. I think, however, the father just has a red cloak around him, and the brother is wearing it too. So I think there's still a family bond there. So it wasn't broken as much as with the son who had left the family, but it still needs some mending, I think. And then also just so again, the painting is a Baroque painting, and we have a tenebrism in it, and the background is murky, kind of obscure, to help us, and the light shines on the three main figures to help us to focus on them. The main figures are set a little bit off center, and I really do this at home. You can see this, I draw lines on the pages. If you would draw a line from this corner to that corner, you divide the picture in two halves, and the note I wrote in it's the lower left half is the heavenly and the forgiveness. On the right side, the upper corner, it's still the the earthly side, it's the human side, and we just have a hard time to kind of let go of things and step forward and open our arms and to embrace someone who comes back and says, I'm sorry. So I think that's us, right? We still have a hard time doing that. So yes, and again, I would just like to leave you with final couple of sentences here. This whole work is dominated by the idea of the victory of love, forgiveness, and charity. The event is treated as the highest act of human wisdom and spiritual nobility. And it takes place in absolute silence and stillness. The act of forgiveness, expressed in both the Father and the Son, becomes a blessing of almost sacramental dignity. Am I ready to conclude? Thank you very much.
And secondly, you can't do what you're doing without a considerable amount of work and time and your scholarship. So thank you for this work. It's a gift for us.
No, you're very welcome, and I really love doing it. I learned so much myself and get to examine my conscience while it's a good time to spend Lent.
And also, I hear from people who watch it on live stream, either now or later. So I know you're reaching a broader audience, and they appreciate it very much.